Hello everybody, this is Martin McConnell, the off-grade gecko, and today I'm going to be talking about primitive fire. Fire, the quintessential human technology. For over 1,000,000 years, people have controlled fire, but it was only fairly recently in that time period, maybe in the last 100,000 years or so, that man actually learned how to make it for himself. Primitive fire is by far the biggest technological revolution in the history of humanity. And the odd thing is that fire actually started before humanity, according to archaeologists. Somewhere around 1,000,000 years ago, people were using fire. According to the archaeological record, people meant other hominid species, such as Australopithecus. Chimpanzees will use fire to their advantage. They will wait for a brush fire to come along, or a lightning bolt to strike some trees, or forest fire, or whatever. And they have learned to scour the outer perimeter of these areas, looking for animals that are injured, burned, dying, and looking basically to scrape up a free meal. And other predators and carnivores will do the same thing, as well as scavengers. Everybody likes a cooked meal, everybody likes a warm meal, and fire provides that easily and quickly. But even 1,000,000 years ago, these hominids were grabbing fire from those areas and bringing them back to the den as coals if they could keep them hot on the way. And they basically would keep them hot by wrapping them in something like this. This is a bundle of cedar, but there are materials like this all over the world. And you could basically stuff a coal in there, a hot coal, and wrap this with moist or wet leaves or just green grass or whatever. Carry this back to your den and then use it to create fire. The main instrument of using fire was being able to keep it alive. Something like this was probably the most common tool used to that measure. Now this is a simple pithy stemmed weed that after the pith rots out, you can pick these off the ground, and they're in this form, and they're basically a hollow tube, and you can use it more or less like an old flute. Blow into one end, air comes out the other, and you can stoke up a hot coal and incinerate whatever's around it, because the temperature of it's going to raise whenever the air hits the coal. And it wouldn't surprise me if ancient people used these. Unfortunately, these biodegrade very, very quickly, so there's probably not going to be any in the archaeological record, though they're very useful. I use one to start fires outside and to start my wood stove inside. These are coals. Okay, blazing, red hot, ready to go. This is just some punk wood that I have laying around here. So ancient people would have been really experienced with this, because to keep a fire going and sustained, a lot of times all you have to start with is a coal. In a way, it was easier, but if the fire ever goes out, what happens? It's lost to you until the next forest fire or brush fire comes along. And this is probably exactly what happened to a lot of people. We find places in the archaeological record where there will be a fire pit in one spot in a cave for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden it just disappears for 1,000 years or so, and then it reappears in the archaeological record in the same spot or a site very close nearby. This is probably not a coincidence, and it's a sign that these people who lived in the cave either abandoned it for some time, or they couldn't come back to make their own fire. Alright, so finding sparking rocks would have been just as difficult, if not more difficult, than finding tinder. But there are certain things in the human mind we associate things together, and this is one of the things that have helped us evolve. Like, we'll make an association between what we see over here and what we see over there, and this makes a remarkable paradigm shift in the way humans think, from carrying fire and nursing it and having something right there that's already hot and ready to go, to observing fire. So when you observe fire, you see sparks flying off the fire. The lighter the material that you're burning, the more sparks seem to come flying off of it. So things that are light and fluffy are not only easier to catch off of a coal, but they are easier to ignite with a spark. But the trick is finding a spark. Now, whoever did this, and I'm sure several people did over the years, was obviously thinking more about what they were doing than we give them credit for. So in the movies, you see somebody just hits a rock and a spark comes flying off and ignites something, and they're like, oh, look, fire. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. Making a fire is quite a bit of work. So just having, even if you have the right materials, so this is a piece of pyrite, iron pyrite. And I actually had to purchase this focus. I actually had to purchase this because I couldn't find anything like this, like iron pyrite or marcasite or anything like that out here in the woods yet. I suspect there's some hematite around here somewhere, but it's going to take me a while to find it. It's not something I could just pick up in a day. You can take a couple of pieces of quartz and smack them together, and they will start to produce these little sparks on the surface. Now with quartz, that tends to be a piezoelectric effect. The crystals are being crushed and they're releasing a lot of energy. This is the same effect that makes a charcoal lighter work. And just hitting two pieces of quartz together, you're not going to get a spark that's capable of traveling, and you're not really going to get a spark that's hot enough to ignite tinder. So ultimately, that falls in vain, but somebody along the line noticed that that spark looked an awful lot like a spark from an actual forest fire, or maybe just from the fire they had burning in the cave. There's a certain smell that goes along with it. So when you hit certain rocks together, this has a little bit of iron in it, and if I strike it with another piece of quartz, aside from crumbling and getting in my face, it contains a very characteristic smell. And it's hard to describe exactly what that smell is, but you recognize it almost instantly as something burning. And if you want to try this, all you have to do is find a rock that contains a little bit of iron. Usually these are red in color, and start sparking them together. And if you're getting sparks, and especially if one of the rocks is starting to blacken where it's being struck, then you can smell those rocks and you'll detect this scent, this very familiar kind of scent. And if you've got a fairly good sparking rock, you'll actually start to see sparks will start to fly off the end. And instead of flying in a straight line like they will with a ferrocerium rod, they'll come out and they'll kind of twirl a bit and move just like the sparks coming up off of a flame. And sometimes you'll even see a little puff of smoke, or it may just be a puff of really, really tiny aggregate that's in there, little microcrystalline pieces of rock that are being wafted away with the wind because they're so small and light. But it looks like smoke, it resembles smoke. So the same thing would be true of friction fire, right? Like if you're rubbing two sticks of wood together really fast, or you're drilling one piece of wood with another, then that's going to create a lot of heat, and that heat is going to start to release smoke. So you've got heat, smoke, light, sparks. And what some smart person did, probably several smart people over the course of thousands and thousands of years, was they put these ideas together like a great big puzzle. A very specific tinder is required. So today I spent much of my morning running around gathering up every kind of tinder I could find, from cedar tree stuff to found some fat wood while I was out there and just used a rock to knock a couple pieces loose, to this little guy, or what's left of this little guy. So this is a type of tinder fungus. Tinder funguses tend to grow on birch trees, and this one's really old and it's dried out and it's hardened up pretty good. So I had to crush this up pretty good to make it usable. I basically had to crush it into a powder between two other rocks. So I don't know if fat wood powder will actually ignite off of this pyrite yet or not. I'm going to have to find me another metallic rock to try this on at some point. But this stuff has a very special quality, this fire tinder, or this fungus, tinder fungus. That special quality is that when this forms an ember, that ember is glowing and burning hot enough that it will auto-ignite all the material around it. So once this catches, and it can catch, it's got a very low temperature of ignition and a very hot burn rate. So these two things combined means it will catch the tiniest of sparks, the coldest of sparks, and ignite. And then once it's lit, then it will continue to ignite all the other stuff around it. Now this doesn't come without some preparation also. Like, you can't just take this fungus off the tree and use it. It has to be dried out. And when it gets to this stage where it's pretty much all hardened up, this isn't even really the best quality stuff. You're looking for actually a lighter color in here off a slightly fresher fungus for processing. But even when it's crushed into a powder, sometimes it won't take a spark so easily. But once it does, then you're golden. Like, you got your little spark and it's burning, and you just start piling stuff up on it and blowing on it and get it to burn hotter, and then before you know it, you have fire, which is how I started this today, from one of these and a little spark. You'll never get a flame out of this little guy, no matter how hard you try. Like, it will not. There's no gases in here to release. It's just a very, very dry, very fibrous, lightweight bundle. There are other things that I found around here. Downy fibers from a dogwood, or not a dogwood, a dogbane, or milkweed plant. Downy fibers from a milkweed plant. Downy fibers from all these other plants that are kind of like dandelions. They ignite very easy. They have a flame, but they go out quickly. So this allows you to keep and maintain that burn. This also have been discovered long, long before this percussion fire starting method, because this was an ideal way to carry a coal. You just basically dig out a little hole in this fungus and you drop your coal in there, and then you can carry this for hours and it will keep that coal hot and burning. And then when you get to where you want to be, you just drop the little coal back out of there, reignite it, use your little stick to blow on it if you have to, and then you've got fire, as long as you have enough source material around to burn. So basically, you see the sparks, and it takes a pretty impressive mind. I mean, think about how deep of a revelation that must have been, seeing a couple sparks fly off of a shiny rock and making the direct comparison that those sparks are maybe the same thing as those sparks. But that stuff burns all the time. When is the last time you've seen a rock burn? You know, it kind of reminds me of the movie Idiocracy, where they're sitting around a little conference table and that one kid leans back and he's like, well, I ain't never seen no plant grow out of no toilet. And they're talking about water makes plants grow. So people will reject an idea even if it's right in front of their face, a lot of times. So you have to imagine the revolution that must have been to be the person to call that out, or to see somebody call that out and say, hey, these are the same thing. There's fire inside of that rock. We just have to figure out how to get it out. And I can get sparks, and sparks are the seed of fire. You know, they come out of the fire, they land on our clothes, which were made of leather and animal fibers, and they'll burn a hole right through the leather. So wherever there's sparks landing on things, there's stuff catching fire. So you find the easiest tinder to light. You find the rock that's producing the most sparks, or the combination of rocks and technique, more importantly, to produce the most sparks, and you just shower this piece of tinder with sparks from that rock until it ignites. Now, this is not an easy process. I spent a good part of an hour today trying to light that fire with this guy. And like I said, this isn't an ideal, it's pyrite, but it's difficult to hold, it's difficult to manage. I've got several rocks around here that will kick a spark off if you can get enough force behind it, but you're also trying to hold it really close to your tinder, which is this delicate little pile of dust, without knocking it over, and get a powerful strike on this little tiny thing in your hand. It is not an easy process, okay? And people will spend hours trying to make it work sometimes if they really need a fire. So I can imagine that as being one of those moments where you're like, here, hold my beer, watch this, I'm going to make fire come out of this rock, and everybody laughing at you, and more often than not you probably would have failed, and then you like zip the lip and you go back to thinking about it for the next year or so, and you find some more sparky rocks, and you decide to kind of try off by yourself for a little bit, and then come back and you're like, hey, check this out, and then you get a little coal, and once anybody in the cave had seen that coal, they would know, like, okay, that's it, he's got it, holy cow, how'd that happen? So this marked a technological innovation, not only a technological innovation, but a different way of thinking, because normally you wouldn't equate rocks with fire. Nobody would, not even today. Aside from knowing kind of the history of it, and even then, people don't equate rocks to fire. You don't see a rock and say, oh, I can make a fire with that. It just doesn't happen. I see these in the woods, and I'm like, yeah, I can make a fire with that thing, but the familiarity is just not there with rocks, and it never was, even from the beginning, except for that one time period where that was the main cause of fire making. And once we learned to harness this potential, I mean, we separated ourselves from the chimps, and from even modern birds use fire to their advantage, and they'll run around and start fires and carry fires. A crow will pick up a lit cigarette and run over and drop it in a chimney, and then they'll go get another lit cigarette and drop it in the chimney, and they'll keep doing this till smoke starts coming out of the chimney, and then they'll use the smoke to bathe themselves of parasites and things on their feathers, mites and such. There are birds of prey in Australia that actually have been known to start forest fires simply so that they can recreate that image of poor scared animals running away, and they just swoop down and grab them in the middle of the confusion and get a free meal, so burn down a whole forest just to get a meal. It's kind of, that wouldn't be a very good human behavior, but birds have been known to do worse. So we really separated ourselves by being the only species so far to be able to create fire, and we weren't the only species to be able to do this. Neanderthals were more than likely able to do it. I mean, they lived in the frozen north. Survival without fire must have been a pretty good necessity for them. Modern humans could do it, and maybe a couple of our common ancestors from further on down the line, maybe they could do it too. You never know. So being able to harness it, use it, and this was technology that would have been gained and lost over time, right? So if only one person in the village has a particular skill for lighting fires, they light a couple of them and then they die off, they get eaten by a tiger or something, then the rest of the village is kind of like, okay, crap, well, we don't have his magic rock, and they might go looking for one, they might fail again for several generations before some kid hears the story of their great ancestor that could make fire and decides to give it another knock or another try, or another village maybe brings fire back to them. So there were probably a lot of times where the only fire you had to depend on was the one that was burning, because you couldn't make another one even after this technology had been harnessed, because it wouldn't have been universal and ubiquitous. These rocks are fairly hard to come by, despite the fact that pyrite is just about everywhere in the entire planet. A big enough chunk of pyrite or hematite to be able to spark off of is a little hard to come by. It's not something you're just going to kick up walking around. And these fields, all these forests behind me have been walked for hundreds of years by modern people, picking up every shiny object they laid eyes on. So the chances of just kicking one out of the dirt, not likely. If I want the stuff for myself, I'm probably going to have to dig for it. Whereas there's broken chert and things of that nature everywhere. These little metallic rocks, you got to look a little harder for them. But people would have been excavating mines for chert, for stone tools and things like that, for flint. And a lot of these kinds of rocks are found in conjunction with that as well. So once mining took place, then shiny rocks would have started coming out, as well as crystals and other useful things. So this doesn't just spark the beginning of, of a new technology. This literally sparks every new technology after it, and even at the time, it sparked a completely different way of looking at the world. Instead of looking at the world and taking everything for granted as what it is, you kind of learn to look at the world symbolically. Like, if you see smoke coming out of anything, even if, like, you're grinding up this little powder, okay, to make your your fungus, to prepare it, and you sit here and grind away at this, and you roll it around, and it turns into dust, and every once in a while you see a little puff of something come out of it, and you're like, oh, was that smoke? You know, because if you don't know that it's just the dust coming off of it, it looks like smoke. It doesn't really smell like smoke, it smells like old shoes, but yeah, you'll see that smoke and you're like, okay, well, this is tinder, and this is our best tinder, and it's making smoke, so that's pretty interesting. Maybe things that smoke when you crush them up make good fire tinder. And it turns out that 99% of the time this is actually true. Like this thing, if I grind it up, little tiny particles of powder are going to come fly away. Anything you can powderize to the point where it will volatilize itself and fly off, generally that stuff tends to make a really good tinder. And the finer you grind it up, the more smoke you see, and the more of those tiny particles are in there. Whenever rocks spark, or anytime you see anything spark, that could create a fire. Fire itself could have also been the origin for things like the idea of earth, wind, air, or earth, wind, water, and fire being composite mixtures of everything. I mean, if you look at a stick burn, what happens? First, water starts to bubble out of the end. Smoke's coming off of it as it's charring, and the flaming nights, so there's fire coming out of it. And when it's done, the earth, the white ash that's left over, drops to the bottom of the pit. I mean, that's all. It's got all the things in it. So we looked at rocks and we say, okay, well, maybe rocks are made of fire too, because they can create sparks. They're just a very different kind of fire. They're like a cold fire, maybe. Who knows? You know, what went through the minds of primitive humans. But on some relation, we started looking at the world differently than any other animal. Like, we didn't just see cause and effect relationships. We started drawing connections between things that were unrelated. So looking at clouds and seeing shapes and images, looking at cliff faces and seeing images. These are all modes of thinking that we still carry around with us, you know, that we apply something to something totally unrelated. We apply qualities to it of things that are familiar, and we make distinctions between the two, comparisons between the two. Even today, people look at pictures of Mars or the surface of Pluto, and you look at the surface of Pluto, and what do you see? Big old heart. Hi, here I am. Or the face on Mars, or this pyramid thing down in Antarctica, just wherever, and we automatically like, that has to be related to this. Somehow you draw that connection, and that's a very fundamental human trait. Like, that's something we carry around inside of us from the moment that we applied that same line of thinking to sparking rocks. So we said, there's fire in there, I can get it out. That's kind of a profound thought. And even though it seems a little silly looking at Neanderthals and early man, we still see it here today. We still do the same thing, and that, like, the ability to create fire shows that that type of thinking had shown up, and it had appeared in us. It had also shown up in Neanderthals and appeared in them, and Denisovans, and everybody else who, all the other species that created fire for themselves. So we think of these people as being simple, primitive, but they looked at the world in much the exact same way that we do today. They drew conclusions in the exact same way that we do today. They made comparisons between things. They started putting puzzles together. I mean, fire is the original great puzzle of humanity, and putting all the pieces together wasn't easy. It required a leap of faith to go from, okay, this thing's making something that looks like sparks, to I think I could start a fire with this. Hold my beer. And that pivotal moment gave us everything. It gave us all of our technology, which is based on fire, just because that's the kind of creatures we are. Like, all of our technology, literally all of it, is based on that campfire. And at the same time, it gave us our thinking and reasoning, which allowed us to not only create religion, but also to create philosophy and start thinking about things a little bit differently than animals think about them. Whereas animals might see a cause and effect relationship, my cats might be able to figure out how to open the screen door, or turn on a water faucet to get a drink of water. Cause and effect is one thing, but actually applying those morphisms to different unrelated things is something uniquely human. So while we're not the only critters that use fire, so far, until more evidence gets found, we seem to be the only creatures that relate things that are unrelated and draw connections and lines between things just due to certain familiarities, just transient little things, like you see a little puff of smoke. Even a dust devil, might be seen as that thing's carrying some kind of fire because it looks like a big plume of smoke. It's just not getting hot enough to ignite. I held off on this video because I wanted to talk about pre-fire stuff for a while before I got into it, because it just opens so many doorways to other things. But at the same time, we've been carrying this with us as long as we've been human. So even if we weren't making it, we started off knowing how to harness it and knowing how to keep one going. And so it's a very integral part of the human condition and human beings in general. It's something we've always had. Maybe we might miss it for a generation or two if we're with the wrong clan, but we've always had it. It's always been here. It's been part of our culture from day one. So with that said, now we open the door to the real human experience. Where do we go from here? And there are dozens of technological innovations that come directly out of the fire, and I'm going to be starting those very soon on the next Pure Primitive videos, so I hope you'll stick around for those, or just go ahead and subscribe and hit the bell so you'll know when they come up. Anyways, it is getting cold out here really fast now that the sun's gone down. I'm gonna go ahead and stoke this fire and then get on with the next thing that I've got to do. So I hope you enjoyed this little philosophical dialogue. I know I'm not like running around in the woods, and I'm kind of calm and sitting in one spot. This was something that deserved a lot more than me sitting and making a fire with a hand drill, because there is a lot to it, and it is such an important achievement for human beings, and it's time we looked at that achievement in a little more detail and really saw it for the ingenious mechanism that it is. And it's that mechanism that every single one of us carries around inside of us. So, food for thought. Yeah, don't be strangers. Hope to see you next time. And y'all have a very good night. Okay?